was like, oh, it's a little bit like St. Andrew's building. Double painted shed.
Except that they
It's a different reason.
designed it in.
Can you open the windows in your offices?
I can. I can now.
Right.
Yeah. There was a point when they couldn't be opened. Yeah.
By the way, Jane's question to you was not what I told her.
I
And I was
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to University of Glasgow's new Advanced Research Centre. We're delighted to be hosting this year's Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival for the first time. We're also delighted that it overlaps with our own festival, Arcadia, which will take place from the 16th to the 30th September and celebrates the opening of this building and all the research that will happen here. So all Arcadia events are free. You'll find the programme details on the flyers that we've left on your seats. And this weekend, we have lots of events happening here. We have tours, we have an outdoor ceilidh on the Saturday. And if you're interested in the design of the building and what goes on inside, you can join our talk with the architects and researchers at 3 p.m. on the Saturday. Full details are available on the webpage. So we'll now hand over to Stephen, who will share more about the Doors Open Day events and introduce tonight's talk.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, how are you? My name is Stephen Sheriff. I'm the Events and Development Coordinator for Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. GBPT is essentially a charitable property developer. We work to rescue, repair and return to their communities buildings at risk across the city. We've also been delivering Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival since 1990, and we work in partnership with the Scottish Civic Trust. And Doors Open Days is now a national event in every single region in Scotland, so I encourage you to go onto the national website and find out what you can see across the country. We are very grateful to the university for hosting us here today in this amazing building. A special thanks have got to go to Cassie Dillon, Zara Gladman, Ken Skeldon, who have been working alongside us to realise this event. Thanks also to the tech team here at the university and to Dunkley, who's working with us to make sure all the gremlins stay in check. This event is being live broadcast. During the Digital Festival in 2020, we found a really fantastic audience, and we want to continue to be able to make the festival as accessible as possible. So this event will be on our YouTube channel, it's on our website, on our Facebook, and the Twitter. So if you want to see it again or recommend it to anyone else, you can do just by logging onto our YouTube channel. I'd like to thank our supporters, Glasgow City Council, the Arlington Bats, Page Park, Gardner and Theobald, all of the other sponsors that you can see up on the screen here who really make this event possible. Doors Open Days, like many cultural events, is still struggling to recover from the impact of the pandemic. So if anyone would like to make a donation, we are selling t-shirts at the front door, and one of the volunteers will be happy to sort you out. Just a couple of health and safety things to go through before I hand over to our speakers. We're not expecting a fire alarm this evening, but in the unlikely event, please proceed through the doors behind you, across the floor and to the courtyard at the back where the assembly point is. So I'm now going to hand over to Alan Leslie. Alan is a heritage practitioner for 35 years. He's worked in academia, tertiary education and archaeological contracting and consultancy. He was one of three founding directors of INHERIT, the Institute for Heritage and Sustainable Human Development. In January 2017, a co-founder and director of Northlight Heritage, and before that, a managing director of GARD, as well as a lecturer in archaeology at the University of Glasgow from 1992 to 2011. Alan.
I've got this one, thank you, Steve.
if I'm on. Am I on? Splendid. Thank you. Yes, I did all of that, and I show all of the signs of it, I'm afraid, to this day. Thank you all for coming, first of all. It's lovely to see such a good turnout. I hope you're going to be buzzing by the end of it, but I also hope that you're going to be joining in, because that's one of the things that we'd like to see. This is supposed to be a public-facing space, and in this context, you're the public. So please do jump in and get involved. Before that, just a couple of things I want to say. The first one is that this is the brainchild of one of Stephen's colleagues, Ingrid Shearer, who is unable to be with us this evening in person because, unfortunately, she's contracted COVID. But I believe that she's listening in just now. So hi, Ingrid, if you're there. We managed to get it on, and keep listening. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. The second thing I want to tell you is about the title, Kallipolis, which in ancient Greek means the ideal or the beautiful city. But I think Ingrid was drawn to it because she could see a better title, which is to have help murder in front of the name. Think about it. Help murder, Callipolis. Yeah. I think that deserved to be put in there. Now, another thing that we're trying to do, I suppose, today is give some insight into some of the more arcane subject areas that are covered in the university, and in this case, particularly in the School of Education, but make them a little bit more accessible for you. And I'm sure we've got the right people on the panel today to do that. The suggestion that we start with philosophy as a jumping off point, and in particular Plato, could be a little bit daunting for a lot of people. I hope that you will find by the end of it that it's not. It's a good jumping off point because it allows a bit of debate to be started. As I say, I'd like this event to be a little bit less academic, but I can't help pitching in here with a little obscure starting point of my own from my own academic research a long, long time ago, which is to suggest that although you'll be hearing about how Plato thinks about the city from Philip very shortly, there was somebody that came before him, a chap called Hippodamus of Miletus, who has been kind of airbrushed out of history. We only know about him because of Aristotle, who talks about him and is quite kind of dismissive of him in a lot of ways. He's quite unpleasant to him because he had long hair, which apparently wasn't very fashionable in those days. It was the sign of a dandy from Athens, I'm told. But he was the man who really brought town planning in a systematic way to some of the more famous Greek cities like Miletus, which he takes his name from, and also Piraeus, the modern-day port of Athens. So he's kind of seen as a father of town planning. He was a philosopher, and it was that philosophy that underpinned the way that he went about designing the city, which was essentially that familiar grid pattern which we see today in a lot of modern cities, and which we see also in those ancient cities. But he was also credited as the originator of the tripartite division of citizens, which is something that Plato picks up, although in a slightly different form. The tripartite division of land into public, private, and sacred. So we'll hear about this very shortly. But the basic idea is that he was a thinker, but a thinker in practical terms who wanted to see how these thoughts could influence the way that we live in the physical spaces around about us. So that seems like a good opportunity to call on the first of our panelists tonight. Now, I just want to go through the three of them so that you're aware of them before we bring in Philip to speak. But on your left, as you look at the three panelists there, we have Dr. Philip Toner. Philip is a lecturer in education at the University of Glasgow, and his work explores themes at the intersection of history, philosophy, anthropology, heritage, and education, which is quite remarkable. He's the author of 3 books, Heidegger Metaphysics and the Univocity of Being, Phenomenology Between Aesthetics and Idealism, and Dwelling, Heidegger, Archaeology, Mortality. He's also a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and a co-director of the new University of Glasgow Arts Lab theme, Islands in the Global Age, in the College of Arts. I think that was impressive. Wait till we hear the other 2. Sarah, who's on your far right, is a senior lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Glasgow. She's a former high school special educator from the United States of America, and she was a Fulbright scholar to Norway. And as I've just found out, you don't ever not become a Fulbright scholar. It kind of continues on. So I'll maybe hear a little bit more from her about that. Sarah's research interests include teacher appraisal for continual improvement, progress monitoring for response to intervention, high impact practices, and effective instructional strategies. So yes, impressive indeed. And then we come to Ria. Now Ria's in the centre of the threesome there. A senior lecturer in geography, environment and sustainability within the School of Education. Ria was appointed as a climate ambassador during COP26 and is an associate director of the Centre for Sustainable Solutions and the co-lead for the Challenges in Changing Cities interdisciplinary research theme at the University of Glasgow. She specialises in eco-pedagogy as a route to enabling both an understanding of the climate crisis and empowering individuals, communities and organisations to initiate sustainable solutions through research, education and partnership. That's us. She's currently leading community collaboration work within the Gallant Project, based within the Centre for Sustainable Solutions. And she's also interested in alternative means of knowledge creation and understanding beyond science, and how these influence the transmission and circulation of notions of environmental sustainability. Ria's recent publications address community involvement in environmental sustainability initiatives, the meaning of citizen science experiences to involved individuals, and the role of participatory science in sustainable development. I think you'll agree, a very impressive panel. So without further ado, let's hear from the first of them. Philip, can I invite you to come and tell us about Plato?
Thanks very much, Alan. Is this on? Is this on? Yes, it is. It's excellent. Well, yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I want to extend my thanks to everyone who was involved in the organisation of this. Of course, notwithstanding who's not well. Yeah, so I thought I would start off just by revisiting briefly the description of the event, and I really wanted just to pose this question: can philosophy help us better cities? Now, the good thing about philosophy is that it's an activity, it's something we do, and to follow the Greek example, it's something perhaps best done in community and conversation, and through that we can get somewhere, get towards truth, if never actually achieving it. But I think that it's a good opportunity tonight to engage a little bit, to and fro between us all, and hopefully get a sense of what we think collectively, about what it means to live in a city, what it means to dwell in a city, what it means to continue to be interested in developing cities, to see them as something that has a dimension of the future about them and not just something archaic and of the past. So I'm also a teacher, and I'd like to start, if this is working. Go again? Yeah. Excellent. With something that we teachers like to do, which is I see, I think, I wonder. Okay? And I'd like you to have a look at this, and I would like you to tell me first of all what you see. Just feel free to shout out.
4 people.
Yep. 4 people. What are they doing? Bar or a diner, absolutely. What do you wonder about the picture?
Chap on his own.
Yeah, what's he doing there? Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts about it? Any other wonder?
The time of the day.
Right. Okay. Is it early morning before the sun comes up, or evening after the sun's gone down? What do you think about it? Bleak. Yeah. Well, I really like this picture. I've got a picture of this. I printed this at home, and one of the things I like about Hopper's paintings is the narrative quality. You want to tell a story around it. And Hopper himself said that unconsciously of this picture, that unconsciously he was probably painting the loneliness of a city, and that's something that strikes me about it. And he has the reputation of someone who has the ability to capture perhaps that quality, perhaps the idea of isolation that we do often see in the contemporary city, or reflected in thinking about it, poetry about it, art about it. But I've obviously deliberately put these two together because not only does the first picture carry this quality about it, it also brings in the fact that we've just gone through this this event, this isolation that we've all had, enforced. And if you've been out at all during the pandemic and the times you were allowed out, you probably noticed just how like a ghost town it was, And it was interesting to go through this process of isolation throughout the whole thing. So not only is she looking out the window, our colleague here, our friend here, has got a mask on, doing what modern people do, and that is typing away on a laptop, completely isolated, completely individuated, right down to themselves, purely interacting with the screen and not anywhere around them. And the last one, excursion into philosophy, which is what we're all having a go at tonight doing. Okay. Again, this is a nice image. I imagine that it's probably the same model from the previous picture, but a different room. Again, I'm drawn to wonder what this individual, this gentleman, is thinking. But what's interesting about it is that the book and the bed is actually by Plato. Right? It was later identified that that's what the book was. And it's quite interesting to see this in terms of, if you know about anything about the cave analogy. You've got someone here partly in the light and someone here partly in the dark, and you wonder whether or not they're drawn between, thinking abstract thoughts, thinking about the ideals and so on, and then of reality, and being pulled back into the more worldly dimensions of things. This is another nice image to think about, but an excursion into philosophy. So it was Plato and Aristotle, but as we've discovered, they weren't first. But the Greeks, well, it's just the Greeks were the first to start thinking about philosophizing about cities. This idea that Alan's mentioned, of course, is that the Kallipolis, this idea of an ideal, a beautiful city. Plato himself, it seems more like he's talking about a state than just a city. But he does talk about, in this model, of having three dimensions: the rulers, the auxiliaries, and the workers. And he tends to think about, he's posing the question about justice, what makes a city a just place? And here's your three dimensions that would add up to that, if you like. You'd have philosopher kings ruling the city, right? The most educated, the most enlightened. Then you'd have your auxiliaries keeping the peace, okay? And you'd have your workers producing, right? Your workers doing things, but not doing anything more than that, just not getting in the way of the auxiliaries and not getting in the way of the enlightened philosopher kings. The idea was an analogy with Plato's view of the human soul as taking part in three areas as well. And just as you would have justice in a city, a just city under that model, you'd have a just person. And in this case, you would have reason, which would be the ruler of your soul, right, the ruler. You'd also have your spirit, and these would correspond to the auxiliaries. And you'd have your appetites and your desires, and that would be the production, the producing part. And the idea is that reason's the sovereign. It's reason that we really ought to be subject to, and not our desires. And he uses that analogy with the city. So if you think the producers are a bit more like, your desires that have to be kept in check through reason, and ultimately it's the enlightened philosophical part of the soul, if you like, our reason that is the thing that ought to be producing the overall determination of what it is to be just in the city, right? Just in the soul, just in the city. Aristotle came along after Plato, of course, and he argues that a city itself is composed of different kinds. There has to be difference in a city. As he puts it, similar people can't bring a city into existence. It's a very interesting thought, that I quite like that idea that, you wouldn't have a city if you didn't have difference in it. Maybe he's going back to Plato's idea that there has to be some class of people that are producing, there has to be some class of people that are keeping the peace, and there has to be rulers in some way. But it's not good enough just to have one class, because then nothing would ever get done, I think, maybe. Okay. And his idea was to combine the rule of the few and the rule of law, so that you would have something a bit more distributed than just the philosopher king. I'll finish on this slide and hand over to my colleagues, but I think there's a lovely quote there from Richard Sennett, who's a sociologist, and he points out that the built environment is one thing, so everything that we see around us, all the physical stuff that we inhabit is one thing, but the way in which we inhabit it, the way in which we dwell in it is quite another. It's not that we can have one size fits all for people. That's why we do see different design and why people choose to live in different kinds of places if they can. But the idea is that it's dwelling, human dwelling is not just about being in a place and not interacting with it. You know, we tend to extend our association with the play through memory. We do it through our desires, you know, as Plato saw in the production side of things. We, if you like, mortar the walls with memory. You know, we build up a particular association with a particular place. So this place, although it's a new building, this was a hospital, and we probably all, if you grew up in Glasgow, you might have been in the hospital at some point. So there's a previous association with the place, and it's something that helps you, if you like, navigate it. It's not impersonal, right? The narratives we bring with us in our own minds about places help us to, if you like, inhabit them, not just live in them. Right? And a little quote from the Middle Ages there: "City air makes you free." It might make you free, but one of the questions we have to ask is, does it make you happy? Thanks.
Lovely. No, take that away, Philip. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's some food for thought. Now, I'm going to ask Ria to pick up from there. And I just want to, as a little kind of challenge, Ria, I was trying to recover some memories of reading Plato when I had the misfortune to have to do it at university and not do it very well. And Philip will keep me right, but I think it's called Phaedrus. And there was a quote. So this is another one of these ones where Plato writes about Socrates talking to, in this case, a young man called Phaedrus. And they're wandering about, and at one point, Phaedrus says, it's a bit like, if you know the Molesworth books, it's a bit like Fotherington Thomas, hello clouds, hello sky. Oh, why don't we all just pack a bag and go and hike in the hills? And Socrates kind of comes snapping back at him and says, I can't learn anything from landscape and trees. All I need is the people in the city in order to teach me everything that I need to know. Now, Ria, I think you probably have something to say about that. So, Ria, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, that would be great. Hi, everyone. So I guess I'm going to pick up on that in terms of bringing a sort of contemporary space to think about this, in terms of the fact that I'm a person engaged in environmental education, but thinking about that as a lifelong process which everyone has a right to. And I find the notion of eco-pedagogy, even though it's quite jargony, something that's really worth kind of spending the time thinking about, and I'll explain that concept before I go any further, because I might lose you there if I don't. So I've set up these 3 provocations for you to think about today. So the first one is, can eco-pedagogy with city communities help us address coupled climate and ecological crisis? So eco-pedagogy is a practice that takes into account the time and space in which people are living. It builds upon Paulo Freire's ideas of critical pedagogy. And Paulo Freire was a Brazilian scholar who was working with illiterate farmers, and he did these amazing activities of showing the kind of flashcards and all sorts of participatory methods to what he called raising consciousness, process of consciousness raising, so that those farmers would have access to the powerful knowledge that they needed to actually challenge some of the practices that were being imposed upon them, and challenge some of the policies. So eco-pedagogy kind of takes that idea and runs with it and says, if we are facing these massive climate and ecological crises in this time, how can we raise consciousness? How can we raise ecological consciousness about our connections, our interconnections with the natural world, the power that we have to create change, to perhaps influence corporates in terms of the practices that they're undertaking, and really think about our power as people. So I'm sort of an eco-pedagogic scholar, in terms of that I teach primary school teachers about these things, and sort of covertly try to get these things into the classrooms all over Scotland. We're thinking about that. But I also work in community spaces. So I'll look at things like citizen science, which is a practice of collecting environmental data, but through that practice people also learn a great deal. So if they're monitoring trees, they learn all about about the trees in their local areas. If they're monitoring rivers, they might learn about kind of pollution issues locally and then act on those issues in kind of local spaces. So that, for me, I guess I've answered my own question there, is thinking about, can eco-pedagogy make this change? I'd say yes, it can, because it's this attuned practice that helps us to connect these really big global issues like climate change that can feel really abstract and overwhelming, but in really tangible ways. So it's about kind of getting your hands in the mud, fishing invertebrates out of rivers or whatever, and getting that understanding from, that may not have been present in our educations, because, a lot of education steers us away from that connection with the natural world and is so much about kind of, gaining employability and skills in other fields. So for me, it's eco-pedagogy. How can, even if you do live in a city and you don't, you're not out on Loch Lomond, but there are places everywhere where you can find nature connection in cities, and ways of deepening that connection through practices like eco-pedagogy, like citizen science, that I'd consider to be an eco-pedagogic act. So that's my first provocation. The second one is about universities. So universities building meaningful relationships with cities, communities to address local and global issues. So I'd say that this very practice that we're involved in here, you could say this is kind of an eco-pedagogic practice, that we're trying to have conversations that break down barriers between communities and the kind of lofty university institutions. And I think that the kind of important thing there is to really think about how we go about those practices. So traditionally, universities could have been accused of kind of very extractive practices with communities, of going in, kind of taking away community knowledge, doing something with it in terms of being in a sort of sterile environment, and not even going back to communities to talk about that. So in my research, I tried to challenge that in terms of thinking about what are the issues that are important to communities, how can we help, how can we be of service to the communities. So it's about changing that relationship as a very foundation. We've got the new project that was recently mentioned, the Gallant Project, which is an acronym for Glasgow as a Living Laboratory Accelerating Novel Transitions. So, yeah, so why you need the acronym. But the idea is that you get a big, massive group of like 30 academics together from all different disciplines, be it biodiversity, systems thinking, education, politics, all across the board. And you get those individuals in a space where you can think about how can you think about the challenges facing the city, but in a way that kind of builds in the knowledge of the university, but thinks about how we can make sure that community knowledge plays a part, that the transitions take the communities with them as well. So my kind of job there is to firstly go out for a whole year and make connections with communities, build trust, build relationships. So I think that's kind of is important. We've got knowledge to share, but we also have a lot to learn, and so that's fundamental. And then the last thing kind of relates to that, so the last question, how can creativity of communities like Glasgow be celebrated to address climate and ecological crisis? So that really is acknowledging that there's so much that's going on in the city that's good already. And so how can we help to be an ally to the people who are already doing amazing things, and to support that and build it up and kind of bring the bits of what we do well to help mobilize and help create a critical mass, because I think that's the best way of kind of going about that. And then also to think about questions of fairness and justice in that sense as well. So who isn't involved in the conversations already about these issues that could be involved if they were enabled to be involved? And can we act as, can we give that any leverage as a university? And that comes down to things like funding, spaces, or all of those kind of things. So we think about that. So just to kind of end there with a kind of cheesy note to say that people do make Glasgow, and I'm really hopeful about people power, and that I see that as being absolutely fundamental to how we transition as a city, and the city's scale is a really important scale of action. So that's me. Thank you.
Maria, thank you very much. That's given us a lot of food for thought. And a tough act to follow, but Sarah, I'm sure you're up to it, because talking to you just before this started, it sounded to me like you'd done an awful lot of work, just kind of helping get young children a lot of the time on board with these ideas. So tell us a bit more.
Absolutely. So I think I get to be kind of the link between the philosophy and the eco-pedagogy as I talk about classrooms and about children and the power that teachers and kids have. And sometimes that voice of youth gets limited, and our children have amazing capacities. And sometimes we fail to turn around and ask. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I have some prepared comments that I want to make sure to tie these threads together. So we're really sitting here grappling with some of these conceptualizations of this ideal city. And I want to take us back to nearly a year ago when the youth organized protest march was held here in Glasgow during COP26. And we saw thousands of young people forego school, my two sons included, as part of the school strike for climate movement. And in that response, we really identify that this climate change issue is really the defining issue of their time. And children want to have a voice. And they took that opportunity to use their voice as the world watched. And the city streets literally echoed with their voices as they were calling for climate justice and telling adults to keep the carbon in the soil. And really in that moment, this city not only becomes a place where children dwell, but it becomes their classroom. This city is the classroom of our children. And that is a pretty powerful thing for a city to be. So it was a timely learning context for my colleagues and I to be contributing to the education of new teachers, because really it was a very poignant moment, which I think gets missed sometimes as we think about the way policies roll out. And so in that moment, in that same autumn of 2021, we actually saw revised Scottish teaching standards that actually codified learning for sustainability beyond a professional responsibility to literally what was called a way of being. And so here, where was once implicit, this notion of vocation had always implied that there really should be a civic responsibility. Now this learning for sustainability was actually put into policy. So as COP26 unfolded, two colleagues and I, one of them being Dr. Toner, we were actually teaching an elective module that was titled Heritage, Citizenship, and Sustainability. And this was with future primary school teachers. And in that course, we really take the view that those three concepts are really inseparable. That as you talk about heritage, as you talk about sustainability, and you talk about citizenship, all three interact in many different ways. And so really when we think about it, heritage involves how we construct our past in the present while preserving a set of values that have been deemed important to the creation of the future. So doing this was fundamentally linked to the views of how we ought to act in the present for the sake of our shared future. And so it's in that space that we are working with future teachers. So how fitting that we were teaching this class that involves outdoor learning, the love of place, pro-environmental behaviors, and civic action as leaders from nearly 200 nations congregated nearby. So student reflections were coming in at the time because our future teachers are also out in co-requisite placements within the schools. And so as this was happening, we were hearing accounts coming back in of teachers in training who were having public transit nightmares, who were out doing litter picks with students, who were tree planting, doing circular economy projects, filing eco-school green flag applications, and handling secondhand clothing swaps. So when we think about all these things happening in that space, wow, we are dwelling, and we are dwelling well. So learning for sustainability is an entitlement for learners through Scotland's National Curriculum for Excellence, which is designed to ensure that pupils develop 4 specific capacities: successful learners, confident individuals, responsible citizens, and effective contributors. It has been called an exemplar of educational policy development with an international and global dimension. And indeed, the notion of sustainability has a long antecedent in Scottish educational thinking. So as academics, tasked with preparing our teaching workforce to implement learning for sustainability, we have really found that the affirmative ethos of post-critical pedagogy has been a framework fit for our purpose. So in their manifesto for post-critical pedagogy, Hodgins and colleagues has set out principles founded in a belief in the possibility of change, what you're hearing Ria talk about, what you're hearing cities as a specific place to be able to move that forward. So this is found in both critical theory and pedagogy, but with an optimistic attitude, a post-critical direction that gains purchase on existing conditions founded in hope in what is still to come. So we're at this moment in time to acknowledge and to affirm that there is good in the world worth preserving. Otherwise, there would be no necessity to concern ourselves with the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Post-critical pedagogy is an endeavor to move outside of that repetition of criticality in education to a commitment to go beyond critique, to recognize what is good and what is valuable in our existing spaces. It's not only a means to change or as the desirable change state, but also serves to define what is worthwhile to continue. It's a belief in that transformative potential of education and hope, really, in that present as we transition from what we think about as citizenship in the world to a love for the world. A turning from exposing what's wrong to thinking about how education might come around to solve it. Yet we still see that there are many, many challenges. And when we think about how teachers are called to be in this space of being eco-pedagogues, about understanding the climate change dilemma, we find that sometimes learning for sustainability can be neglected or misrepresented or sometimes underemphasized in that formal classroom. Sometimes teachers struggle with the content knowledge, the training, having the right resources, as well as the pedagogical expertise. And the reality is many social and ecological crises are actually perpetuated by people with post-secondary education. So this compounds the immensity of an overwhelming and politically sensitive topic that teachers are asked to take on. And we know that there are numerous approaches, not necessarily contradictory or mutually exclusive, that are employed by teachers as we move into this space. So in our own teaching, we've really taken an orientation in that post-critical space of the head, the heart, and the hands model of what we call transformative learning. So it's an organizing principle, and it's an integration of intellect, emotion, and body, what we call the activation triad that moves students towards change. So all three need to be in place. So let's first take a look at the head. Learning for sustainability requires the head, the cognitive, the knowledge, thinking, reflection, the expanse of perceptions. It begins with our understanding about what sustainability is, what it is not, and we're looking around some of those prominent questions about what is sustainable, what are some of those changes that are unprecedented in the environment that cause us to look at things around us and say we can't continue in this way. And to that end, learning for sustainability is situated within those unifying concepts of the 17 United Nations Global Sustainable Development Goals and their three interlinking pillars of sustainable development, of social, economic, and environmental. And we're also now at a space and time where teachers can actually utilize some of the climate pact items that were made here in Glasgow as really another further distinct occasion for knowledge building. We have agreed matters such as building resilience to climate change, curbing greenhouse gas emissions, limiting the rise in the global average temperature to 1.5 degrees, recognizing the role of Indigenous people as well as the role of youth, and fulfilling the pledge of providing $100 billion annually to developing countries. These were opportunities for pupils to start making and extracting meaning. And if you didn't know what was actually agreed upon at the Glasgow Climate Pact, now you do. So the affective domain is our next space. This is the heart. It recognizes the role of feeling and of values, of relational knowing, of empathy, the people part, right? So when we think about this piece of the heart, before teachers and communities can help pupils contribute effectively to making their world better, you have to make them want to. A significant emotive event can often be the impetus to change, an awakening to a new truth. Love of place and natural, historic, and cultural heritage often underlie at the heart level that motivation. And so this is actually in that space, as Julia Singleton stated, love of place and a sense of connection or belonging are foundational toward development of sustainability values. People care about and tend to who and what they love. And so we want them to love the place. So the connection of emotion to knowledge can often be that catalyst for critical reflection and action. So let's then move to the hands. The active use of eco-friendly behaviors encompasses the hands and the triad, and this behavioral domain translates knowledge and care into application. Young people in schools today will inherit pressing and intensifying challenges that require action, from the loss of biodiversity to the end of cheap energy, depletion of resources, inequalities in standards of living, and environmentally linked illnesses, just to name a few. Glasgow is actually the place in the United Kingdom right now that has the highest health disparities, which is a pretty difficult piece to think about our children being in that space of dwelling. There appears to be a growing realization that doing, the active use of learning for sustainability concepts by responsible citizens who are effective contributors, requires continued resourcing and support in order to be able to make a difference. So to that end, we look at the ways that teachers can develop projects that are meaningful and developmentally appropriate, that actually bring about experiential and applied learning. And in the classrooms, teachers create a democratic and participatory learning environment and directly teach conflict resolution skills. At the community level, pupils participate in collaborative service learning that meets a need in the local community and can foster civic responsibility. Personally relevant and locally meaningful legacy projects are well positioned to fulfill students' entitlement for learning for a sustainable future. And while supervising some of those pupils that were participating in the COP26 Youth March, I challenged them to respond to the now what prompt of the 3 reflective question model of what, so what, now what. And yes, my son did roll his eyes at me when I asked the question. Pupils decided that even in that space as they marched, first of all, next time we need to bring snacks, because what usually takes us a half hour to walk when you're in a protest march will now take you 4. So they learned a little bit of what civic action entails. They're also going to plan to bring whistles next time. They also decided that even small actions like using bamboo toothbrushes, buying fair trade products, turning down the heat, and walking more could have a small impact. The link of that protest march experience to further consumer activism and supporting socially responsible businesses was a clear demonstration of the hands in action. Those connections made cognitively and emotionally were being translated to choices. So when we think about all these things that teachers are required to do with their pupils, the reality is that this all happened in the city outside the classroom, with parents by their sides as the teachers stayed in those classrooms during that day. So what we see happening, Scotland has actually done some research in this space to look at the difference that learning for sustainability has actually made. And here's what they found after they talked to teachers, to staff, to head teachers, and community representatives. That learning for sustainability in Scotland, being a part of the curriculum, had enhanced learning and motivation and readiness to learn, had increased development of life skills, increased learner confidence, improved reputation and standing of establishments within the community, improved staff morale, well-being, and motivation, enriched school ethos, and influenced improvements to the community spirit. That's a pretty powerful way of dwelling. These findings, along with renewed commitment in revision of our professional standards, have indicated an optimism that educational reform has offered meaning and purpose, and learning for sustainability should be our day-to-day lived experience for us and for our children. We are mindful that without strong knowledge and deep understanding of sustainability dilemmas at a local level, teachers may move forward with reckless enthusiasm. Without heart, pupils are really unlikely to experience activities that are pulled together. They may be disjointed and unfruitful. And without action, a teacher may try to implement a plan that is unlikely to succeed or to continue. Senegalese ecologist Babi Adoum once said, "In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We only love what we understand. We only understand what we are taught." The creativity of teachers and pupils is a poignant opportunity for leaders and leadership in learning for sustainability. As Kuak and Winthrop implored, imagine a world where every school community, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, from China to the US, had students actively engaged in designing and leading projects aimed at curbing and/or adapting to climate change. This November in Egypt, during COP27, there's another prime opportunity to again spotlight the agentic capabilities of young people's head, heart, and hands. A better future, I think, can be created by informed, well-prepared teachers, committed pupils who care and who take action. That rich heritage of this post-industrial city of Glasgow is a place where once massive ships went forward, and now we see these ideas about climate change going forward from the same space.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, if that's not food for thought, I don't know what is with those three presentations. So we would like to hear from you. Your thoughts, your observations, your questions. While you're thinking about that, can I just throw something generally to all three of you? So listening to that, it seems to me one of the issues that kind of links what we've been talking about is where is this impetus coming from? And there does seem to be a tension between what you could call teaching or pedagogy and what you could call prescribing. And actually, if you push it to its furthest limits, that prescribing can start to become oppressive, and it becomes about a lack of choice. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Where does the balance lie? How should we approach this? Particularly thinking here from three people who are dealing with education and thinking about how future generations are going to come through. What is the message that we should be giving them? And just while I'm on the subject, I'll back to Plato. I don't like Plato. And Plato was anti-democratic. He thought the Athenians were fools, did he not? And thought that everything should be nailed down absolutely according to a few elitist people's ideas about how the world should be. Surely that's not the model that we're looking for the future.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so no, I would start just with the philosophical side and then so on. It strikes me listening to the two contributions and thinking about my own one is, philosophy. We're thinking about philosophy, right? And what philosophy can do to help us think about the city and our place in it and the role of the city. And fundamentally, philosophy is something that's involved in education. Right? Philosophy, if you like, in a sense, is education. It's education for grown-ups, right? It's something that we do, we think on, and we pursue difficult questions. So when we go back to something like Plato, we think about Socrates, his mouthpiece, right? Socrates himself was this really kind of awkward character known as the gadfly, this horrible little fly that would buzz around you and ask you awkward questions and expose your ignorance. And when asked for a doctrine to develop, to say, well, go on, Socrates, tell us what you think, tell us what it is, tell us the answer, he would say, well, I don't know. I don't have that. What I know is that I know nothing, right? And I think that there's an important point here about, delivery of knowledge from on high. I don't presume to have that, right? Philosophy for me is something that I engage in. It's something that I try to do, right? And it's always a case of thinking with and trying to work with people that you're engaging with, talking to. That's why I would ask you, what do you see, what do you think, what do you wonder? A little classroom device, but it's right, I think, because after all, it's something that we can all engage in, whatever you call it. People always do ask difficult questions, and they always try to figure out their take on things, their answer, and their place with respect to these questions. So, for both talks, we do not operate in isolation. That's my point about showing you the pictures, from the images from Hopper, is that that is a specific representation of a particular time and place that's not necessarily a particularly happy one or a particularly natural one. We tend to operate in community, and we found that during the pandemic, that when we were isolated, we discovered things about ourselves that, what it meant to be climbing the walls. We wanted it out, we wanted to talk to people, we wanted that interaction. And part of that interaction is an interaction that happens in space. It doesn't happen, in a virtual place. It happens, when you're out mixing with people. And quite often, I think that there's a cultivation involved. Now, Ria talked about the mixing, your hands with the soil and so on. But I think that's exactly right. But it's not just cultivate. It's not only, I should say, not just. It's not only cultivation of the natural environment and the things around us. It's also cultivation of ourselves, right? In and through these acts, we develop, right, and we develop a relationship with ourselves. If you like, what I'm saying is, you are your take on yourself, right? You are how you take yourself to be. And part of the process of engaging with each other in these activities, these community activities, these natural activities, develops a greater sense of well-being. And it's not about delivery of from on high, it's about collaboration.
guess just to build on that, so a couple of things. I think one thing the pandemic did kind of teach us was actually to force us into our kind of more natural habitat a little bit more, that we did go away a little bit from our social worlds that opened up, like the seasons to us and other elements that were around us. And so arguably you could say that kind of city living is part of the issue. And so for me it's like, how do you engage with the kind of natural environments of cities so that we can readdress that balance, and that the sort of interactions in between kind of people and places are really important. So like one of the things we're looking at really strongly in the Gallant Project is the River Clyde and our relationship to the Clyde as a river, and how it's been kind of shaped industry over time, and how we interact with it now or otherwise. So I think it's important to kind of expose those features and have conversations about it. And I guess the other element, the sort of the Plato, so I don't know much about Plato at all. Is that working? Yeah. I don't know much about Plato at all, but from what I've learned today, I don't think I'm a Plato fan either. And I would say that actually, you know, the philosophies that came around in the sort of revolutionary movements of like the 60s and the 70s, you know, people like Paulo Freire, who are really involved and encouraged by those kind of movements of those times, are maybe what we need to look at now in terms of where we need to create revolution and transition. And that kind of idea of going to the people and understanding what knowledge there is within communities already, rather than looking to leaders to kind of lead us out of crisis, but actually to realize that there's a hell of a lot of knowledge that's held, and that actually what we need to do is kind of just allow people to be agents in the transition of places and think about mechanisms for that.
Sarah, there'll be people who will say that sounds great, but do we have time to allow that to emerge in that way? What's the...
Because teachers are also trying to teach kids how to read, how to count, right? How to solve world peace. You know, there's a huge call. There's a huge call in that space. But really, when we think about what the call on teachers is to answer that, we have the opportunity to choose what the curriculum looks like for our kids, what we bring into the classrooms, and consequently also what we leave out. And so as we're teaching things like literacy, we also have the opportunity to be bringing in curriculum that has content that leads towards some of these greater outcomes. So we bring in things about trees. We talk about what it means to be in a place. There is philosophy for children available, and we choose those things to be the things that we bring in for our children to read about, to speak about, to write about, and to listen about. So it's maybe less, time will always be finite, so it is the teacher's responsibility to figure out how to best utilize that time towards multiple aims. And it should look very interdisciplinary, and it should look very place-based. And it should be done with the community, not out with the community. Our schools should be in the streets, and the community should be also in our schools. And so those artificial barriers and boundaries are spaces where we can maximize that a little bit better. I would also say that some of that comes back to when we think about the way cities and schools operate, that the voice of kids should be in any part of that city planning that happens. We have pupil councils in place. We are learning democratic processes, and children are there to have a voice, and sometimes they have better solutions than the grown-ups do. And we could probably save a lot of time, actually, by asking each of those schools to put in joint projects with solutions to some of the things the city faces, and we might be surprised at how quickly we have some outcomes.
Thank you. I'll come and give you this. Oh, good stuff.
Just a little point on that, on giving kids the voice and the possibility to do more with all of that knowledge. Like, I really like this idea of the hand, heart, and head, heart, and hands. And when you were talking about that, I started thinking about how these kids with all of this knowledge, how just because it's so zeitgeisty, the mental health impact of that knowledge on those young minds, and how they will know, yes, there is very little time and we are running out of time. And the pressure on the teachers, they will know this as they're teaching it, as they're facilitating these conversations. And one thing, and kind of like giving people or giving kids some sort of like release, like I love that idea of training them in councils. I've heard of this great idea of giving the vote to kids from the age of 6, which to me solves a lot of the world's problems, because these kids sound amazing, and if these projects are going on, they know more, and it's more about them than ever, you know. So there's just a kind of, just tell your friends there's an idea of giving the vote to 6-year-olds, spread it around. I think it's going to solve a lot of issues.
I don't think Plato would like that.
It's a great idea. 6-year-olds with a vote, all sorts of good things, and dinosaurs. Can't be bad. Other observations? Stephen?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with Ria, what you were saying about you know, spaces like this being so important from people from all sorts of different walks of life, areas of studies. I think, you know, it's when rooms like this can get together, we can, you know, find answers to problems that people can actually go along with, you know. I think when you were talking about, Sarah, about you know, the teachers being kind of responsible for kind of enacting these policies, I could hear my mum's voice in my head. My mum's a primary school teacher, and she was like, "What? You want me to do what?" Like, and it's so much responsibility for the teachers, and you know, teachers are dealing with such social problems in so many schools, and I think, how do we support teachers to actually, you know, to fulfill, you know, these great ideas? Is there space to be, you know, taking learning out of the classroom? You know, we're saying that the city is the school, but should businesses not have a responsibility to be teaching these? How do we educate people, you know, as a city, and not just rely on teachers to actually be delivering this education? Because I just think that, you know, with I know how hard my mum works, and how overworked they are, and how much they struggle. And I know when new ideas come in, sometimes they can be pushed back on. And so if, you know, that responsibility was shared, maybe these things would, you know, be easier to go ahead.
So I think this is where I arrived at looking at eco-pedagogy, from learning for sustainability, education for sustainable development, all these notions, is that actually with eco-pedagogy you recognize the biggest structural system that you're living within, and you know, as well as like doing what you can in whatever space you find, whatever space and time you find yourself, you also recognize that there are bigger barriers and systems. So I think that part of, you know, the teachers do what they can, but recognize that there are wider structural changes that are needed, and that needs to be part of the decision making. And then I've always found myself presented with a conundrum in eco-pedagogy, in that some of the people behind it have kind of said that actually it needs to happen beyond the classroom in every instance. Like the classroom is an oppressive space, and so actually it needs to be, you know, in other kinds of spaces where that knowledge sharing happens. So we had a plant hackathon here this morning with the students, and I was telling them about Ivan Illich and deschooling, you know, how knowledge needed to come from different places. So I'm fully on board with that, especially thinking about communities, cities, and, you know, how knowledge gets shared, and where it comes from is beyond the classroom as much as within, and comes, you know, from the ground up a lot of the time.
Thank you, Ria. Yes, please. Hang on, I'll get this to you.
Was it Plato's model that had leaders, auxiliaries, and workers? Right. Okay. If we take that then and put it on a bigger scale, not just for a city but for a nation, is the problem not here for all of us that the auxiliaries and the workers and everything that's going on in schools and communities and cities is great and is fine, but if the leaders are actually actively working against what's happening, then nothing's going to happen. Is that not the biggest challenge of all?
Oh, I'm glad I'm not answering that. There we go.
Yes. Well, I mean, I suppose like I don't want you coming away thinking that Plato's a really bad guy. The point about the philosopher king, I suppose, is to say that they are supposed to be the ones that are enlightened. They are supposed to be the ones who have gone through and will have genuinely understood what it means to live well and to flourish and so on. I think that's so it's not that Plato was thinking they would be cruel or unkind or work against the people. His idea was that the people were probably less inclined to moderation and these kind of things. You know, you would have like there's this idea of the soul. You know, our desires can run rampant, and the reason part of our self is the part that keeps us in check. And you think later on about someone like Freud, who says, well, okay, you know, you've got an ego id and a super ego. You've got this id that is, you know, the thing that would sit up all night eating chocolate, right, or doing whatever else it does. And you've got the ego, which is yourself, but then you've got the super ego that keeps you in check. You know, I tend to think a little bit like that in the model of the soul. You've got this thing that's keeping you in check, but it's precisely not working against you. It is not the case that it's attempting to farm off goods for itself or enhance its own reputation or enhance its own, feather its own nest, if you like. The idea is that this is the part that knows what's best for you, right? The philosopher king, after all, doesn't really want to do it. You know, they're the leader they're the leader that finds themselves in the role because they are the best placed to know what's best for a human being to flourish.
Plato's model aside, that is the biggest challenge, is it not? That the leaders, both nationally and internationally, are going back from commitments.
It's a problem. It's a real problem.
So just to kind of add to that, I agree that the leadership, like if I could rule the world, I'm going to say, right, this is what we're doing from tomorrow, but that can't happen, sadly. But so the situation that we're in then, in terms of us being educators and engaged with communities, is that, you know, at the very least, we can offer some consolations in terms of, like, how do you deal with eco-anxiety? How do you deal with, you know, all these things that are going on in your head, worrying about climate change? We can have those conversations. We can, you know, bring people together to at least think about how we're going through this together. And there is a difference in speed in terms of, like, when you're doing this work with community and with learning, it has to happen quite slowly, because otherwise it's just going to come as an imposition. And so we have our aspirations as educators, but we also recognize that we're in these wider systems that are problematic, and so we just keep pushing and doing what we can, I guess.
There was a question here. Thank you. There we go.
Just an observation. You're mentioning election theory. It takes me back to the early 70s as a trainee social worker, reading about all this stuff in pedagogy of the oppressed and stuff. And all this stuff, and let's pick up Stephen's point about, you know, it's not just pure teachers and stuff. Mutual aid is the big thing here. Participation is the big thing here. I've just signed up to be a mentor for school kids and stuff like that. It's getting involved with things, and it's not, unfortunately, a lot of the stuff I've had to cut through a lot of your jargon to understand what your message was. And it's very simple, is that we all have a responsibility. It takes a village to raise a child, and we all have to be involved in doing it and doing whatever bit we can. And it's your point about rulers. We've always got rulers. But as an ex-anarchist, it's people's participation that matters in what we do now.
I really wish I had time to go into it being an ex-anarchist. That's an interesting position. Then we want this. I'm just thinking about this. There's also an issue of a counter-narrative in there, because although we're kind of all, I think, pretty much on the same page, there are other people out there who are very intelligent people, and they have a very different worldview, and they have a very different way of doing things. And I mean, one that just comes into my head at the moment is Romer. Professor Romer, Nobel Prize winner, Stanford University, who's got this idea of charter cities. And it's not even the charter city idea itself, which is basically a kind of a let's create a city somewhere which has got different sets of rules from everywhere else in order to try to stimulate, I think, largely economic growth in his case. But he was hoping that it would stimulate other things off the back of that as well. And it's a bit like Oppenheimer with there's it starts off as a perfectly sane idea and suddenly becomes hijacked. And there are now people saying, oh, well, that's the way it's going to go. And the elites will now rule the world and everybody else can just fight it out amongst themselves down in the mire somewhere, which is not so far away from William Rees-Mogg's book from a generation ago, which more or less predicted the same sort of thing, which explains where Jacob came from, I think. But anyway, the counter narratives, it's not the only one that's out there. If we're to address this and try to do some of the things that people have talked about here, how do we deal with that?
I mean, I think it's a perennial problem. I think that we do face is that there is a human tendency to appropriate and to attempt to gain position, and to lead in a particular way that involves the appropriation of wealth and so on. It's always a sad thing when you see it, and I think it's something we all have to guard against, of course. But I think that the hope I would like to leave with to leave with hope rather than despondency, and to say that when I see people working in communities through social work, through community action, through and in schools through the kind of things that Sarah and Ria have been talking about tonight, I do have hope. And I think I see it, with children as well. It takes a long time for a child to become a cynical adult, and I think it's something that we actually have to really work against, and to remain able to imagine things that can be different. I mean, if history tells us anything, I can quote Hegel and say that the one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history, which is a sad point, possibly true, but it does reveal to us change, right? And the idea that things not only can be different but will be different. I mean, there is no doubt, and to retain the hope that potentially it can be better.
Yeah, I think this kind of relates to the point about the jargon, which I completely accept. We are terrible at it. We get so used to talking to each other that actually there's an element of, so I've been learning a bit about this in terms of, we're quite comfortable with these kind of systems thinking ideas, and then you forget that other people might not be having these conversations every day. So we have to be really mindful of like how we're talking. We have to learn from other people who've been doing this stuff a long time about how to go about it, really. And also it kind of relates to that point of that there are counter opinions. Some people you'll never get them on board, and so you just have to kind of accept that with a certain group. But there will be others that you're just not hitting the mark with because your jargon's not landing, or your messaging. So I think I see that as a big part of the work we do in terms of like how do you get your message across in a way that resonates with people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the classrooms are really the hope for our future. I mean, we're looking at the children as the people who are going to shape this next, and we're hoping that we do our due diligence to give them something that they can continue to make change and fight for. So I think we're in a unique space where children's voice here in Scotland has an amplified opportunity to come forward. We have the United Nations Rights for the Convention of the Child that is in schools in ways that have been quite unique. So you have rights respecting schools in this country that have been given many awards about how they have brought in that voice and participation. And so I think these civic experiences that our cities, that you as community members have this opportunity to come alongside our teachers and our students, we do get to leave with that space of hope. And I think maybe that's also the message. It does take a village, and it takes a village that hopes.
Yes. Take that. Thank you. There we go.
Hi, thank you. There was a word that came from your presentation that's just kind of stuck with me, and it was well-being. So I think everything that we're speaking about relates back to well-being and the points that have come from the audience as well today. We're thinking about teachers' well-being, but then relating back to those three circles of what makes a city. How do we cultivate that well-being in ourselves so that we can share that with children, so that we can share that with teachers, so that it can work out ways? And I think being in touch with the environment is such a big part of understanding our own well-being. So I think there's a relationship there. I don't think one comes before the other. And I think, for me, what we're talking about is well-being, and it is mental health, and it is physical health that will hopefully expand out to the rest of the place that we live in. That's kind of the message of hope, I guess, I'm leaving with.
That's a good message. Thank you very much. Now, is there anything else from anyone else? Or shall we? There we go. Can't miss you out. There we go.
Thanks very much. I just had a couple of thoughts that I thought I'd share. I think, so like, I'm a designer, an engineer, and like when you're thinking about design, you're thinking about solving a problem or whatever, but you design something to be used in a certain way or to do a certain thing. And as a result, give or take, like you can only use things in a certain way. Maybe you can get around it, but whatever. I think the city is to some extent the same. And I think the city as it is influences the way that you think in the city and about the city, what's possible in the city, what are the encouraged or discouraged ways of living, thinking about yourself even in the city. And I think for me that leads on to this thought of, well, who is designing that and who's making those decisions? And obviously, you've talked a lot about, we need to have the voices of the communities and ordinary people and workers and kids as well, meaningfully involved in those decisions. I want to distance slightly from this idea that kids are the solution, not because they're not, but because we're all the solution. And I just worry that it's almost like a kind of belated, it's like, oh, well, the kids will grow up, they'll have the good ideas and we'll sort of solve it. Those ideas are here, like they're in this room, they're everywhere. Like the ordinary, like the workers with the bins, we've just had the bin strikes. They know what the problems are, they'll tell you. So I think, it is about empowerment, really. And if we've got these problems and we're thinking, well, why have we got these problems and how do we have a different approach going forwards? But yeah, thanks very much. Oh, actually, no, sorry, another really, really quick one. John Ruskin, I think, has an interesting as well. Like, the thing about the city is, like, the way that you interact with a city depends on your relationship with it. And Ruskin was sort of had this, it was actually religiously motivated, but for him, the idea of the craftsperson or the Gothic architect actually physically being involved in kind of the devotional work of construction imbued those religious buildings with meaning. And could you not think of us all as inhabitants and co-designers of the city, and would that engender a feeling of stewardship towards the city? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really fascinating. I was just watching something that just last night about an art critic talking about somebody who, about certain artists whose work is transformed from being good to great because of the belief that they've invested into the building, which is an interesting, I think that's kind of what you were saying there. Any other questions? I think we have, that's what I'm, just in case anybody was urgently needing one. Okay, well, in that case, we shall draw proceedings to a close. Can I, first of all, thank you all for coming and for pitching in there, particularly towards the end of it. That's been extremely interesting. I think we've all found that quite edifying, and certainly some food for thought. So thank you for that. Thank you. We have our silent expert over here who's been making sure that all of the stuff going online is working okay, and also the sound and so on. So I thank you there, and I thank you to Stephen and to Ingrid, who's sitting at home somewhere, for setting this up and organising it. But most of all, thank you to our three panellists for some really illuminating thoughts, which I'm sure we're all going to take away with us and mull over and hopefully put into action in some form of positive way. Thank you very much indeed.